Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Hello friends, and welcome to this, my 10th episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I have some really hideous historical information to share with you today. So you might want to grab like a cozy blanket, maybe a lollipop. You might want to conjure your happy places in your mind right off the bat, just in case you need to slip away for a few minutes, because it's going to be bad. But I have some really fun information to share too. So before we begin, I just want to say thank you so much for continuing to rate the podcast on Spotify, because it appears that I have been shadow banned on YouTube, which I'm surprised took so long. But anyway, it's kind of a bummer because I was getting so much engagement over there. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of sad. But I've picked myself up. I have dusted myself off. I have dried my tears because you can now leave comments on Spotify if you have the most recent version of the app. Just touch the name of an episode and it brings you to a page where you can see where to add comments. Please tell me what you think of today's episode or any episode. Comments mean a lot to me. They help me know if I'm putting information out there that you actually want to hear. It's hard to tell sometimes because what I talk about is terribly upsetting to most people, like most people I know. I can use a little clarity from time to time. And I make this solemn promise to you, dear listener. If you can bring my Spotify ratings to 100, I will stop bugging you about it at the beginning of every show. I am so close. I have 85 ratings at the moment, and I cherish every single one. As I understand it, these ratings, and I'm now sure the comments as well, indicate to Spotify that my podcast is worth showing in their search suggestions. So, since I've been banished from YouTube, and I do not want to promote the podcast on TikTok by like eating spoonfuls of cinnamon or whatever you kids are doing over there, Spotify and Apple Podcasts is where it's at for me. So please rate, review, subscribe, follow, comment, my darlings, if you want to hear more. In today's episode, we're diving back into the Illustrated Police News from 1871, the insane Victorian publication full of grisly murders, botched suicides, body snatchers, mice and donuts. It was a publication full of complete chaos. I'm going to read a few of these articles and give a little bit of historical context where I'm able. It's a little tricky sometimes because the journalists don't always cite names, locations, or other important factual pieces of information that journalists in other more respectable newspapers would. But some do, and I've found some great historical tidbits about some of this madness that I'm really excited to share. However, a warning, I will be discussing suicide, murder and sexual abuse of children, and some very disturbing descriptions of self-harm in today's episode. So if you're someone who is triggered by these kinds of topics, please be aware that they will be discussed. We begin with an advantageous body snatcher in this article titled, "A Body Snatcher Sells His Own Body and Dies." It reads, "An aged body snatcher in Cincinnati named Cunningham, otherwise known as Old Cunny, died in a hospital a few days ago from disease brought on by late hours and exposure. It is not probably that he robbed graves for the doctors from any feeling of disrespect for corpses, since some time before his own death, he sold his body to physicians in consideration of $50 to him in hand paid." That's the end of the article. I'm certain that most of the articles in this particular paper are at least based in fact, but a good number of them I'm pretty sure were just added to fill out the text at the bottom of the page. This one may have been one of those. It might be true, though. I can't really confirm either way, because if you look up keywords like Old Cunny or Cunningham Body Snatcher, you just get Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the movie results in Google. So again, might have happened, may not have happened. Regardless, a little bit about body snatching while we're on the subject. Body snatchers, who were also known as resurrectionists, were people who stole bodies from graves or morgues and sold them to medical schools for anatomy studies during the 18th and 19th centuries. It was also very common in the United States in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The practice was motivated by the need to meet the demand for bodies from private medical schools. At the time, the only bodies legally available for study were those of executed murderers, but anatomists needed many more. Body snatching was technically not illegal. A body wasn't anyone's property once it was dead, so little could be done to prevent these men from doing this. However, and this is wild, if they took any jewelry or other objects, they could be charged with a felony for stealing those things, so they were very careful to leave all of these things in the coffin. They were part of a national network that involved transporting, storing, and selling bodies to medical schools. The practice was unpopular, understandably, with the public, and cemeteries and mourners began to install gates, cages, and mausoleums to protect their dead. They could also pay gravediggers to dig extra deep to make it harder to get to their loved ones, and some folks even had coffins that would explode if someone tried to open them. In 1878, Philip K. Clover, an artist from Ohio, invented a device called a coffin torpedo to prevent body snatchers from opening a coffin after burial. Or, I guess, destroying them if they opened a coffin after burial. It involved a system of triggers that detonated an explosion of lead balls and shrapnel if it was opened. So body snatching, for a number of reasons, this one certainly being one of them, was a deadly, dangerous profession. There's a fantastic series starring Sean Bean called The Frankenstein Chronicles that included a scene where a coffin explodes and wooden shrapnel gets all stuck in him. I loved that series. I wish they made more seasons. I think I'm going to have to do an entire episode on this topic, though, because it's far too interesting. I'll just, for now, hit and run with the body snatching and drive us over to a deeply disturbing article titled "An Insane Mother Strangles Her Child." This is very, very sad. The article reads, "The vagaries of the insane are sometimes particularly terrible. Their most terrifying form is perhaps the murder of children by the mother, which has happened in several instances of mental aberration during the last year. In Brooklyn, New York, on the 27th, an estimable lady named Mary Voorhees was washing her little infant daughter about 2 months old. A lady occupant of the same house was present and remarked to her, quote, 'How well baby looks. She is getting along nicely, and you have every reason to be proud of her.' End quote. The lady then went upstairs to her own apartment, but in a few minutes recalled, and on entering the room again, saw the child laying dead upon its mother's lap, she having strangled it. Dr. Jones was soon sent for, and an inquest was held. It transpired that the mother was insane. She was infused with the idea that the child was starving to death and that she was unable to take care of it, and in this belief had destroyed it. Quote, 'I did it, but I did not mean to,' was her only answer to all the questions put to her, and her grief was terrible to behold. It further appears that the woman's insanity was hereditary, her father and sister having been afflicted in the same way, though with no such fatal consequences. A verdict in accordance with the foregoing facts was rendered, and arrangements for sending the woman to an insane asylum were made." That's the end of the article. I tried looking up this woman's name and details about the story to see if I could find what became of her, but I couldn't find anything. Infanticide by mothers was a significant issue in the 19th century. Factors like poverty, evil laws like the New Poor Law of 1834 that removed any financial or moral responsibility from fathers of illegitimate children, placing 100% of the cost and care of a child on the mother, that absolutely also contributed to this issue. But almost always, when a woman killed her children, they were labeled insane and sent to insane asylums instead of prison, unless it was blatantly clear that the child was killed out of malice or abuse. Sending women to insane asylums in general was a go-to solution for everything from women who murdered their children to just experiencing depression or anxiety. It was just an absolute tragedy. But what do you say we transition from this upsetting story to a horrible axe murder, shall we? We're staying with the topic of insanity for now. It's funny. Well, no, the insanity is not funny. But what I'm about to say. When I organize the order of articles to discuss, I try to group them by topic, and I shuddered a bit when I realized I was like, okay, murders by insane people go here, rampaging women go here, murders by complete psychopaths go here, botched suicides here, successful ones here. Don't worry, I've included some chuckles as well, some donut-loving mice, some hilarious snake oil advertisements, so it's not all nightmare fuel. But this next one is, so buckle up. The headline is, "An insane son brains his father with an axe." Now that is what I call a headline. The article reads, near New Providence, Clark County, Indiana, some 18 miles north of New Albany, lived an old man named James Howell and his family, all highly respected people and good citizens. One of Mr. Howell's sons, a young man, has for some time been suffering from insanity, but as he had always been quiet and inoffensive, he was allowed to wander around at will, always conducting himself in a kindly and cheerful manner. Monday morning, the 30th, Mr. Howell accompanied his insane son, left the house in which they resided for a clearing for the purpose of piling up and burning brush. They had scarcely got to work when the young man, in a sudden mania for murder, seized an axe and dealt his father a terrible blow with its edge upon his head, fairly cleaving the skull asunder and doubtless producing instant death. After committing the bloody deed, the young man left the scene and went to the neighbors, where he asked for and received his breakfast. The family discovered much blood upon his hands and clothing, asked where it came from, and the insane man replied that it was his father's blood. The neighbor immediately instituted a search for the father and found him where he had been murdered with the axe, lying near him. The alarm was immediately given, and young Howell was placed under arrest. The coroner of the county was sent for and held an inquest, and the jury returned a verdict in accordance with the above related facts. Of course, they will exempt the insane son from punishment, but he should be sent to the state insane asylum where he can do no more harm. End quote. I find it really interesting that in this and in the previous article, there's some legitimate compassion for them and little consideration that the murders could have been premeditated. Insanity, as a broad term, appeared to be like the only requirement to not send these people to prison at this time, and send them somewhere much more horrible. It's interesting to note that the term mental illness wasn't even used until the early 20th century. Up until the 20th century, mental illnesses were almost always considered incurable, often hereditary, sometimes demonic aberrations of the brain, at least in Western society. Not until the 1950s was the Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Health formed by the American Psychiatric Association. Their role was to study mentally disabling conditions and develop a national mental health program. But this shift in mental health perception began much earlier. In the mental hygiene movement, this was initiated in 1908, that sought to improve the conditions and quality of treatment for people with mental disorders. Sigmund Freud, who founded the concept of psychoanalysis, he set up his clinical practice in Vienna in 1886. So this time was arguably the very beginnings of any understanding that the mind's health can be altered by talk therapy, for example. Okay, so this next one is, again, probably one of those stories that they came up with just to add a little fluff at the bottom of the page. But I love the use of language in this. It also mentions something I discussed in episode 9 on deadly Victorian fashion called Paris green, the poisonous arsenic dye used in everything from fabrics to wallpaper and candy. The headline is, "A Man Gives Up the Ghost Because His Wife Deserts Him." It's pretty fucking heartless. It reads, Thursday noon the 9th, a man named Thomas Spillets, 35 years of age, procured a quantity of Paris green and went to his residence on South Street, Williamsburg, Long Island, where he stretched himself out and breathed his last. He was interviewed by the police before he died and told them that he had recently lived at the corner of Reason Street and Graham Avenue, that his wife and family had moved away without notifying him of their intentions, and for that reason, he had concluded to go over to the majority. End quote. I never heard that term before. Go over to the majority? Okay, so there are a lot of plot holes in this story and a bit of a murky timeline. Like, at what point did he tell the police that he had decided to kill himself? And what were they doing there? Why didn't they stop him? Etc. A lot of question marks around this one, but a fascinating little tidbit that I wouldn't have understood if I made this podcast before my last one. It's that bit about Paris green. Again, I go into this deadly dye in my last episode called Dangerous and Deadly Victorian Fashion, but what's interesting here is that I think by this time, arsenic itself was just nicknamed Paris green. This article was written in 1871, and poor Matilda Schurer, the young woman who used this green dye to color fabric leaves to make flower crowns, died from inhaling it in 1861. This was a widely published, devastating, nightmarish death that caused the dye to go almost completely out of fashion at that time. So by the 1870s, it appears that the dye was just so synonymous with arsenic that people may have just nicknamed arsenic Paris green by that point. The same is mentioned in the next article called Juvenile Suicide, a Little Girl of 11 Swallows Paris Green. It reads, in New York on Thursday afternoon, the 26th, Bertha Smith, aged 11 years of precocious development and residing with her parents at 659 10th Avenue, asked permission of her mother to visit the American Institute Fair. Her request was refused on the grounds that the distance was too great and that there was no one to accompany her. The girl represented that some of her female friends were going and that she would be back by daylight. The mother was inexorable, and Bertha fretted and moped about all day, not caring to disguise or control her annoyance. Bertha had read in the newspapers that many persons had committed suicide by swallowing Paris green, and in her childish despair determined to put an end to her life in the same way. With a portion of some money that she had stolen, she easily procured at a neighboring drugstore several ounces of the poison for the destruction of rats. Retiring to her room, she deliberately mingled a portion of it with water and drank it. For an hour or more she held out, until racked by the violent internal pains, and then disclosed her condition to her mother. A surgeon was immediately sent for, who applied a stomach pump and the other antidotes and restoratives his art suggested, but in spite of all his efforts, the little sufferer gradually sank and died a victim to her oversensitiveness. So far, no blame attaches anyone in this strange affair. End quote. That's the end of the article. It's all quite upsetting. This article is very likely regarding an actual child suicide, but as to the reasons for it and her precociousness and sensitiveness, I think we could have done without some of the embellishment and assumptions. But again, this wasn't a publication known for its integrity, which brings us to the advertisement section. And they really give a clear picture about who the intended audience was for this content. This one advertisement reads, this is the title, "Young Man!" exclamation point. You have been unfortunate and have contracted a fearful disease. You wish to be cured and saved from exposure. Enclose 50 cents in a letter with your address, and you will receive by return of mail, in a strong sealed envelope, a little book of 120 pages called The Medical Magnet, or Every One His Own Doctor. This is the only work published treating on private diseases common to male and female that contains recipes for the cure of the same. It gives the symptoms of the different diseases, follows them in their different stages, with recipes written in plain language for their cure. From his work, the unfortunate can learn their precise situation, take their pencil and make out a prescription which can be procured at any drugstore, and by following the instructions, be cured and save exposure. The medicines are so prepared that they are simple, correct, and effective, curing in some cases in the short space of 6 days. Dr. John Cooper, 150 Fulton Street, New York. End quote. I love that there's no specification of exactly which diseases he's referring to, but they can be cured in as little as 6 days. I don't quite understand if this guy is saying you can find a prescription writing book at any drugstore and write yourself up a prescription for a treatment of syphilis with opium, morphine, and mercury. But I think that could be what he meant. It wasn't until the 1890s that states started to restrict the sale of opium, for example, to people without a licensed doctor's prescription. You could buy morphine without a prescription until the 1930s at any drugstore, similar to laudanum. Not until the early 20th century did you require anything other than money to purchase laudanum. So yeah, I have a feeling this advertiser is saying that his little book of, quote, treatments for, quote, private diseases can tell you exactly which drugs to take if you had, the clap, for example. All of which would not have worked, by the way, whatever it was that this little book said. Penicillin, which treated syphilis, wasn't used until 1948. Gonorrhea wasn't successfully treated until 1930, until penicillin took over as that treatment, until it became resistant to penicillin, and not until 1963 was it successfully treated with ampicillin, which had a success rate of 98%. Herpes, as we all know, still does not have a cure. However, I have a feeling Dr. John Cooper's little book did have one, though. 150 Fulton Street in New York, where this doctor, quote-unquote, sold snake oil books, is now an H&R Block. By the way, I checked. Here are a few other short ads that are great. This one reads, Dr. H.D. Crindle, Professor of Midwifery and the Diseases of Women and Children, 25 years successful practice, guarantees relief to ladies in trouble with or without medicine. Prices of medicine $5 and $10, sent anywhere. All private diseases treated with a skill unsurpassed. No mercury, no detention from business. Residence and office 120 West 26th Street, New York City. That's the end of that one. Again, no specificity of which diseases exactly, but he's got the cure. Believe you me. Dr. H.D. Crindle's midwifery business is now a Buffalo Exchange clothing store, 120 West 26th Street. I love the title of this last one. It is, This is No Humbug. It continues, by sending 35 cents with age, height, color of eyes, and hair, you will receive by return of mail a correct picture of your future husband or wife with name and date of marriage. Address W. Fox P.O. Drawer, number 248 Fulton Street, New York. This address today is the World Trade Center Memorial. I wonder how much money they actually made with these scams. I wonder where they'd get those pictures. Hilarious. Okay. This next article is bananas. It's called A Termagant on the Rampage at Kansas City, Missouri. I had never heard that word before, so I looked it up. A termagant is defined as a harsh-tempered or overbearing woman. It's also defined as an imaginary deity of violent and turbulent character, often appearing in morality plays. I have a feeling the first definition was inspired by the second. The article reads, Kansas City is rapidly imbibing the elements of modern civilization and joining its eastern sisters in the progress of social liberty and the supremacy of the fairer and weaker sex. Last night, a healthy specimen of, quote, God's last best gift to man, end quote, went to the theater in Kansas City and demanded free admission. Strange to say, her modest request was not complied with, whereupon she drew a revolver, an article of use and ornament much in vogue among the gentle females of the West, forced her way in, smashed all the windows in the lower story, choked the manager, and whipped the crowd. It is impossible now to deny that woman, quote, knows her rights and knowing, dares maintain, end quote. Okay, let's discuss. It's kind of hard to follow because the man's misogyny is vacillating between sarcasm and irony and trying to make some kind of point that 1800s feminist women are out of their minds, although she didn't do anything feminist. I think he's confusing feminism with demanding free tickets to the theater and choking people out and pistol whipping people when you don't get your way. It's important to note that women's suffrage was heating up by the 1870s. The movement officially began in 1848 with the first Women's Rights Convention, otherwise known as the Seneca Falls Convention, by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The convention included many issues, but chief among them was the intended right for women to vote. But not for black women, though. That's an important aside. This movement was fiercely opposed by many groups, including liquor industries, textile mill owners, railroad owners, and some women's groups, the OG Tradwives. Opponents believed that women having a say in how their country is run would change labor laws, harm businesses, destroy the family unit, dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. It's been literally over 170 years, and we are still fighting over this horseshit. I mean, I love this article. It just shows the lunacy of the men's rights types, like the flailing and desperate, silly disconnect with reality. It makes me wonder what actually happened, though, because there's no way that this happened. Certainly not the way that he's describing it. Like, if it happened at all. I imagine some woman may have gone on like a total rampage at a theater for some reason. I mean, she lived in a time period with guys like this after all, but perhaps this guy just took the opportunity to turn maybe a story of a drunk woman in a theater into anti-gender equality propaganda, like this next article, which you're gonna love. The title reads, Attempt of Strong-Minded Females to Vote in Recent New York Election. It reads, Modesty, propriety, decency, and all the attributes which lend a grace and charm to womanhood are ignored by females of the, quote, strong-minded persuasion in their eager and insane struggles to obtain what they can never have, the right to suffrage. At a recent New York election, a party of these, quote, crowing hens, undismayed by the presence of roughs, bullies, and shoulder hitters, unabashed by the oaths and obscenity of the contemptuous crowd, marched up to the polls in one of the precincts and attempted to deposit their ballots. They were, of course, very properly refused and retired discomfited amid the hoots and jeers of the bystanders. When woman unsexes herself by claiming the privileges of her superior man, she loses all claim to the respect and protection from the stronger sex to which she would otherwise be entitled. End quote. A lot to unpack there, but honestly, this is nothing we don't still hear in our current political discourse. But here's the great news about this article. That man is dead now, dead and buried, and you can be rest assured that the worms played pinochle on his snout, and he did not live to hear Aretha Franklin, the voice of God. He never got to experience bebop, but it is possible that if this butthead and these courageous ladies lived another 49 years after the writing of this article, they all saw women get the right to vote in 1920. And if he or those women didn't live to see it, well, their daughters certainly did. Let's make the ghosts of those courageous ladies proud in November. That's my plan. The worms go in, the worms go out. Scary stories to tell in the dark traumatized the daylights out of me when I was a kid. I feel such fondness for them now. All right, this next one hurts to read. It's called A Man Stabs Himself 7 Times with a Butcher Knife and Then Thinks Better of It. It's similar to the story of the man who went over to the majority, but far more intense. Okay, it reads, It requires some pluck in a man to commit suicide deliberately and effectively. William Granlick of Detroit, Michigan, lacks the requisite courage, although he made a good showing on Sunday morning. He awoke on that morning to find that his drinking and carousing had driven his family away, and his home was broken up. After breakfast, he concluded to cash in his checks. Accordingly, he armed himself with a butcher knife, and as he didn't want to spill his blood about the house, he went out about 5 miles on the railroad, made for a haystack, took off his coat, vest, necktie, and prepared for the sacrifice. God. He didn't intend to kill himself all at once, and therefore struck the butcher knife with his left breast, and then his right, and then drew it under his chin, inflicting severe wounds in each case. He then sat down to wait for death, calculating that he would bleed to death in about 15 minutes. At the end of that time, the idiot had lost the plot, or more blood, but was far from being dead. He then determined to seek out another spot and accordingly took his clothes on his arm and walked on another mile, found a fence corner romantic enough in looks to suit him, and there he stabbed himself several times more, and also drew the knife across his throat again. When he was done, he was covered with blood, chilled with cold, and he suddenly made up his mind that he wouldn't die. He then walked to the house of a milkman, told his story, hired the man to carry him home, and 2 surgeons fixed him up good as new. He will probably never be able to screw his courage up to the sticking place. End quote. I don't want to talk about this one. I just really love that line. After breakfast, he concluded to cash in his checks. That's up there with going over to the majority and giving up the ghost for me. We got to bring these back into the common vernacular. Okay, let's take a hard left over here to this article, which is very disturbing and upsetting, simply called Boston Horrors. The terrible things I'm about to read are all confirmed true events, by the way, and I'll give some historical context when I finish reading the article. I'm going to skip a little bit of the beginning of the article, which is pretty much just trying to set the reader up for what they're about to hear. It's quite lengthy. A bit further down the article, it reads, "Looking back only a few years, we see a black record in the criminal annals of Boston, and 2 of the crimes that stain not only the city, but darken humanity itself stand out with horrible distinctness. In that part of the outskirts of Boston, formerly known as West Roxbury, is a forest. On the borders of the wood is a little monument heap of stones marking the place where the Joyce children were murdered some 6.5 years ago. On Sunday, June 18, 1865, was discovered here the body of Isabella N. Joyce, 15 years of age, and a short distance beyond the body of her little brother, John L. Joyce, 12 years old. The little girl had been ravished, gagged by stuffing her mouth with leaves, and killed with 10 stabs of a long-bladed knife. The little boy had evidently fled from the horrible scene where his sister was killed and was pursued by the fiend, who inflicted 8 stabs in his back, 3 of them passing through his little fluttering heart. These 2 children had started on Monday the 12th to walk out to West Roxbury, and the damnable deed was doubtless perpetrated on that day. The infernal brute who committed this crime has never been apprehended. Thomas Ainsley, a painter, was arrested and held in durance a considerable time, but no evidence against him being found, he was discharged. Great exertions were made to discover the murderer, but in vain, and the affair had nearly faded out of the memory of the multitude until it was revived by the perpetration of that other ravishment and cruel murder near the city on Tuesday night, the 24th. The perpetrator of the, quote, Western Avenue tragedy, as it is called by the Boston papers, has not, at this time of writing, been discovered, and the detectives, stimulated by the offer of a reward of $3,000, are actively searching for him. Several vagabonds with faces scratched or clothes discolored have been arrested and discharged. The first impression of the community and of the police was that Sylvester Hayes, a quondam lover of the unfortunate girl, was the guilty party, but the evidence adduced before the coroner's jury exonerated him from suspicion, and he was discharged. It seems wonderful that such a crime could be committed on a public highway on the outskirts of a city without some intervention during the act or prompt discovery of the criminal. where slept the red lightnings of heaven when the poor girl was in her death struggle with a man armed with an iron weapon prepared for its murderous use? Her screams were lost in the night air, and the fiend, having accomplished his hellish purpose, fled away in the darkness. Where? He is gone the way of the murderer of the Joyce children, never to be apprehended and brought to the bar of justice? ? End quote. That's the end of the article. Jesus Christ. Okay. You may have noticed the name of the victim that was just being spoken about is missing from the article. I don't know why her name was left out of the article, but I found it. Her name was Kate Lehan. Her body was discovered by a milkman driving to Boston on the 25th. She had been murdered the night before. She worked as a servant to the family of Mrs. H. Brown. She was raped, and her skull had been ultimately crushed by a 20-pound stone. There were 3 other deep wounds in her head, made with a furnace wrench, discovered a few feet away, that was wrapped in blood-stained paper. That must have been the, quote, iron weapon mentioned in the article. Marks of human teeth were found on one of her fingers, and one of her fingernails had been ripped off completely. They sadly never found her killer. However, they may have found the killer of the children in the beginning of the story, but it's not for certain. The Joyce children murders happened exactly how the journalist wrote it, by the way. Just absolutely devastating. A few years after the murder of Kate Lehan, a man named Franklin B. Evans, a suspected serial killer, was convicted in 1874 of a number of horrible murders, a few of which he confessed to, but the Joyce murders were also considered to be his as well, although it couldn't be proven. He was suspected of at least 3 other child murders in Maine and Massachusetts, but denied responsibility. He was found guilty for the brutal murder of his niece and later confessed to another similar crime in the town of Derry in 1850. He was hanged in New Hampshire State Prison for Men in 1874. Again, Ms. Lehan's killer has never been caught. Guys, I am so sorry. I am really sorry about all this. This was just terrible. And on so many levels. But don't worry. I didn't forget the article about the donut mouse. This will certainly make you feel a little bit better. The article's title is A Surprise Party at Hartford, Connecticut, The Mouse and the Donut. It reads, Friday evening, a lady of this city was surprised, and on the whole she had reason to be. She was at supper, and on the table reposed, among other edibles, a plate of brown and apparently toothsome donuts. Donuts, by the way, is in quotes. It continues. The lady took up one and was conveying it to her mouth when there sprang from it a vigorous little mouse, which landed on her shoulder, scampered around her neck, descended to the floor, and speedily vanished in some friendly crevice. The lady screamed, of course, as under the circumstances she was perfectly excusable for doing, and when she recovered from the shock, the donut was examined. It was found that while it remained in the pantry, the mouse had gnawed a hole through one side of the dessert, had scooped out a little hollow, and had there established his winter's quarters. The pressure of the lady's hand upon the donut as she took it up probably troubled his mouseship, and he made an abrupt departure as above stated. His mouseship. It's so cute it almost makes me forget about the guy who failed at stabbing himself to death. Ah, that was nice. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to hear more, please rate, review, comment, and subscribe. Be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in your nightmares.